Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Backstage Podcast with your hosts, Grace and Jade. And this week we have a returning guest. I think he's actually like the highest grossing, uh, the guest that we've had on the podcast so far. He's officially podcast royalty when it comes to the Backstage Bikini Podcast, but you will know of him. It is Ross Byrne. He's a leading coach, prep coach in the UK, and educator. And Mr. Ross Byrne, thank you for coming back on.
That's a pleasure. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of time to find the time to sit opposite Grace right now and do this again.
Yeah, we dragged him on kicking and screaming, but he's back because he loves us bikini girls.
Yeah, or because I was made.
Yeah, we'll go with it first. But
I'm glad to be back.
thank you for coming back. But no, today we really wanted to pick your brains, Ross, specifically about something that we've actually touched on quite a bit in terms of the podcast topics recently. It's been related to other things within an athlete journey, but we thought that it deserved a podcast of its own, really, just to get to the nitty gritty of it. And what we want to talk about today is stress, the role of stress in the athlete journey, and whether it is positive, negative, in what circumstances does it become a challenge, or where can it be the driver of change and success. So really, to break it down and to talk in simple layman's terms, what is stress? What is it, and how does it sort of manifest in the body?
Stress is like this. Most of the time, it's this kind of like overarching thing that you're kind of just told that is going to happen. It's hard to. I'd say it's quite a hard thing to define stress. I would say, because of kind of like, do you go the physiological route? Do you just going to say what it is? Things that feel bad. So that's kind of the basis of stress. But no, for the most part, stress is the name that we give to mechanisms of action that come from the brain that trigger our body to do certain things in certain environments. It's just a response from something that you're giving it. Some responses are stress responses, and the body responds to those stresses. And the big thing to understand about stress is it's not an inherently bad thing. Stress is the reason that we have anti-inflammatory processes that kick off in the body when we need them to, like post-training sessions. So understanding these ideas and understanding all the different mechanisms of stress, and kind of what I think the best way of doing this is to kind of go through what stress actually does, what its role is, what cortisol's role is, what some of the other stress hormones are, because there's technically not just one. You have things like neuroepinephrine, you've got normal epinephrine. So kind of just looking at cortisol is the big term that you'll see when people talk about stress predominantly. So kind of the majority of conversations that you'll have around the impact of stress will be revolving around the impacts of cortisol and these hormones and what they're doing. Because essentially what stress is, it is the response of the things that we need cortisol to do. It is amplified to the point that it starts to do the opposite, and it doesn't work the way it normally does.
Yeah, and I mean, that's it, isn't it? I think from my point of view as well, even in my athlete journey, I think you understandably associate stress with a negative connotation. I think physiologically as well, we put our bodies under immense measures of stress, but that can elicit a positive response and a negative response. So going back to what you just said about sort of breaking it down, what it is, what's the physiological impact of stress or cortisol or the other sort of derivatives. So can you talk us through that?
Okay. So stress does a shitload of things. So cortisol regulates your metabolism. It regulates certain hormonal secretions. Stress response capacity is technically regulated by cortisol, and it regulates things like immune responses. And then obviously its biggest role, or at least the role that we probably understand it more for, is like an anti-inflammatory. Like cortisone, for example, is like a synthetic derivative of cortisol, and it's used to treat massive pain in people's body. That people get cortisol injections, same kind of idea. So the stress is responsible for all these processes, or it influences or regulates these processes. Like we said, metabolism. We know that stress has an impact, or cortisol has an impact, a positive one, on metabolism. The use of energy for food, for example, is another one. Hormonal secretions, it regulates these things, because essentially what stress is and what kind of cortisols are is the responses. They respond to an outside stimuli, and then that stimuli is registered throughout the body, and then the following kind of responses will happen at that, or in conjunction with. So other responses from the HPA, which is kind of the same place where your sex hormones come from. So the cortisol's impact on all these different cells, they're called G protein cells, but that doesn't necessarily matter too much. The corticoid receptors as well is another one. All these are placed along lots of tissues in the body. These things that respond to cortisol, where cortisol can quote unquote bind. And whenever you're looking to think, how does this affect this? Whether it's hormones, whether it's cortisol, whether it's testosterone, estrogen, you're thinking about where that hormone can actually bind. and what tissues are that hormone with, sorry, what binding sites, and where tissues do we have those binding sites. And with cortisol, it's pretty much a global thing, and with stress, it's pretty much a global thing. So that's what gives you the understanding that stress is something that inherently affects the entire body. Because like I said, it's a regulatory thing. It's regulating feedback for certain responses. If it regulates too much of the shit that it has to do, it can often actually drop off so that your cortisol is actually too low to the point that it won't do anything. There's so many different elements that come into it. And that's usually responsive overexerting that stress and overexerting the stress response. You're not necessarily, doing yourself an injustice by being stressed. What's happening is the impact of that stress and the effect that that's having on the kind of downstream mechanisms of your body is what's affecting those other elements. Things like the use of even like fluid retention is responsible. It affects the body's retention of fluid so that you can then utilize that fluid in an emergency situation when we look at things like neuroepinephrine and epinephrine, which are other stress hormones. So when you're looking at kind of what stresses impacts are on the body, the overseeing idea is that it helps respond to the things around it. But if you're always letting the things around you stress you out, if everything is stress, if you're allowing your body to come under a shitload of stress, if you're not managing your stress, if you're just prone to stress, you're allowing those things that are normally good happen at such a high rate that they stop being efficacious. And that's kind of the overwhelming and overarching idea around what stress is doing to our bodies. And then in terms of kind of how we get more specific with it, it kind of comes into obviously the bodybuilding aspect of it. And, I'm trying not to get too, I could go deeper and deeper on it, but I think because like physiology is one of those complex things, I think just relaying the information back to specific points instead of just letting it ramble, because I'll just keep going.
Absolutely.
Feel free.
As athletes, we put our body under a lot of stress about off season and prep settings. And I suppose because it's the topic is so broad, I suppose even just talking specifically about bikini athletes and how it relates to us. So what kind of level of stress would you expect to see, I suppose, beyond us as bikini athletes, and how would you manage it in a prep scenario? And is there an optimal level of stress for us athletes?
For sure. So without sounding like I'm making total assumptions, I think you guys are both bikini athletes. You guys tend to stress a little bit more than most. Please don't.
For real.
Yeah, for real. Stress a little bit more than most. Now, I personally, again, Grace knows how I work with my bikini girls. I personally have no issue with that. I tend to be on a personal level quite good at managing that aspect of things. I think just being approachable and being conversational, and just I'm willing to have longer conversations with people about whatever I need to talk about, maybe than other coaches were. But even beyond that, the impacts of stress on a female, I think, are more in your face, because of the impact that it has on these really, really potent, mechanistic pathways in the body that largely orientate around your sex hormones, I would say. It's more so the impact of stress, the sex hormones, the impact of long-term energy availability loss, which is really what stress is. It's governed by these long-term periods of time with low intake of food and, higher intakes of output. Like the body is constantly being told to prepare itself for something horrendous. That's essentially what the body is going through in a prep. You're telling it to prepare itself. Like nothing is good out here. Help me, help me. That's kind of what you're asking your body to do when it comes to stress. And sometimes stress says, "Wait, fucking relax, man. I can't give you this much." And that's when stress becomes chronic, and when you open yourself up to symptoms. So if you think about the stress that you are open to within a prep scenario, it's going to be the deeper you get into that hole, is the more you're going to open yourself up to that stress. Because not the horrible thing, but it's pretty unnecessary word, but the interesting thing, and probably the unfortunate thing more than anything for prep, is that your tolerability to stress goes down as you actually get to the end of a prep, but your susceptibility goes up. So it's this kind of inverted curve that you really didn't want to see. If we were in a business meeting and they showed you that curve, we'd be fucked. It's that kind of thing. So when it comes to understanding these things, as you get to the latter end of it all, you're really dealing with the highest propensity for stress that you can get on top of. And unfortunately, most of that is just going to have to happen. You're going to have to go pretty deep with your food. You're going to have to go pretty high with your cardio. This is bodybuilding. You can't avoid stress, but you can do your best to manage it. And it's just trying to avoid the unnecessary stresses. So managing your preps better, obviously, is going to allow you to have that kind of thing, communicating with your coach and just being yourself open to that. And then beyond that, obviously within the off-season setting, it's just the susceptibility to fatigue. It's all really the susceptibility to fatigue. You're more open to it within a prep scenario, So I wouldn't say there's an optimal level of stress, but I do think there is an optimal or a good way to manage stress. Your ability to manage stress more than anything is going to be what you need to have in an optimal fashion, because I wouldn't say there's any optimal level of stress. It's a necessary thing, but what is absolutely necessary is an ability to manage that stress so that it doesn't get away. So like your optimal stressors are going to be your training, your cardio, like these are things that you're openly allowing to stress you out. Some lipolytic compounds, if you're using drugs, they're going to physiologically stress you out to a point. And then it's the things that you have control over that you need to be more concerned with, your ability to just check in with yourself. Are you doing a little bit of journaling? Are you speaking to yourself well? Are you doing something to just manage the mental toll of prep? Are you doing anything along those lines? Most athletes aren't, and I think they need to be. I think there's an ideal thing in this bodybuilding thing. It's like, no, it's not bad for my mental health. And chronically, there's a debate that it is or it isn't. If you're feeling bad, talk to somebody, like do something about it. It doesn't matter if you're on prep or not. Just because you're on prep doesn't mean you just need to like take everything away. Just do what you got to do to check in with yourself, be with your friends, your family, your parents, if they support you. Just do something. Are you doing things like, getting some recovery work done? Like, what are you doing to control, and what are you not allowing become a stress that could easily become one, or even vice versa? What are you allowing to become a stress that could easily be pushed out as not one? If the dog takes a piss on the ground in the kitchen, is it really going to derail your entire prep? No, it's like, oh God, the dog pissed in the kitchen, I'll clean it up and get on with myself. But if you were like, you're crying and, you're waiting for your next meal and the dog has pissed on the carpet, that's, this is a real story, by the way.
Jane's just probably thinking.
Yeah, this is real grace. No, I'm people that obviously, it was way too specific for people not to realize straight away that I'm talking about this.
I know, I'm looking at Jade, and people listening are probably like, oh yeah, I've had that with a bowl of oats that I dropped on the floor.
No, Grace does that as well. Oh, the oats have been cooked for 10 seconds longer than I usually do. I have to remake them on my days. Ruined. But we all have them. We all have them.
I did it. I cried my eyes out because I came home one day and it was my first ever prep. And I went to the freezer and there was no frozen veg because my sister had ate it all, and I had a meltdown. And I mean, my dad came in and was like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, there's no veg and I've got no energy to walk to Tesco. And he had to go for me. So I was broken.
It's funny though, because I've got Yemi sitting across from me, and he's probably the complete opposite of me in a prep. It's probably so chill. Like, he burned his oats the other day and it was like totally fine. So there's definitely something to be said about female versus male preps, because we definitely don't handle it the same.
No, you definitely don't. The fact that you even made a big deal out of a fella slightly burning his oats and eating them anyway. No, that's like this massive thing. He burned his oats and he ate them. That guy's brain. That guy's real brain.
Inspiration in smoke.
Inspiration. Yeah, he's really in the trenches. That guy.
But that's it though, isn't it? Like, it's that. I mean, it's perception as well. I think from a hormonal standpoint as well, Ross, is there something physiologically not wrong with us females? But I'm trying not to say wrong. But is there something physiologically that would drive that response ever so slightly differently to a male, or is it just us bikini girls that are just a little bit more susceptible to stress?
On a technicality, like, there's no real difference. Like, you could go really deep into the woods and you could actually look at like the amount of nervous tissue somebody has, and we can get really into the woods when it comes to susceptibility to fatigue, which inevitably leads to distress. But I wouldn't say there's anything inherently that females could probably kind of have that opens up their susceptibility. But I would say probably is a factor is the role of higher androgens and higher drugs. You guys don't have the opportunity to use these drugs at a higher level or at all in some circumstances, so there's some of those effects that I think are probably offset in that respect for a male. They just don't feel as like less of the person who they actually are, because they have these things that are like pushing that kind of capacity for male orientated dominating traits further along. You guys are really only pushing that so far, when again, it depends on how you're doing this thing. The vast majority of athletes at some point in time are probably doing things that no matter what, they're going to feel kind of shit due to its impact on sex hormones, be that natural or assisted. So that comes into play. So I would say from an emotional standpoint, maybe the barrier of entry is a little bit thinner for you guys in terms of stress to get accrued through. But I guess you could say on the technicality is there's not anything I can think off the top of my head. Again, if I think of anything that comes into my head while I'm talking, I would. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head that genuinely allows females to be more open to stress as it stands. Like you could continue to go deeper into kind of things that they've looked into things like instinctual behavior, like in protection modes and like things like that. But so far as like really, really open and unwavering, not really. Yeah, I think you guys just, you know, handle stress a little
Just
bit worse.
sensitive individuals.
Yeah, essentially.
Arguably, our preps are challenging. I know it's all relative at the end of the day, but a lot of us have to dig quite hard.
No, I would argue.
So,
I would argue that there's, again, like you said yourself, like there's a higher volume of food present in males, no matter what. Usually, unless you're me, in which case I definitely had bikini calories, and you know, I feel these girls. I'm with you. You know.
It's painful.
Yeah,
Painful.
it's horrendous. It is horrendous. And then my bikini wouldn't fit. My strap broke.
Oh, for God's sake! You want to go and kit? Come on, man.
No,
Bikini 101.
It was my first time.
oh gosh. But I suppose in terms of like symptomology and stuff like that, like where do you kind of maybe draw the line as a coach if you feel like, you know, the stress throughout a prep and the symptoms that a client is experiencing is almost too much, that it's taking away from the prep itself? Because we've spoken about it kind of with Hannah Wares and stuff, and like the idea around, you know, quitting if it kind of gets too challenging. Is there any like a limit that you're like, okay, right, this is too much for the individual, that's actually taking away from the process more than it's adding to it?
So I can say, bar recently, funny enough, I've never really hit this point before where I've had to be like, okay, this is too much for this person on a physiological basis. I need to pull them out of it. So the body will tell you. So we talked about earlier on the impact of stress and cortisol and other kind of stress hormones, and you know the tissues in which they bind on and the systems which they react upon. So one of them was the immunosuppressive system. So again, you've got immune systems. Excuse me. You got the immune system that inevitably are going to be affected by this kind of thing. So when you look at the immune system, if you're being hammered away with the impacts of stress and the impacts of just the stress and stuff like that, in terms of like kind of summarizing it, if you just think of everything that makes a prep difficult, that's kind of what your stressors are. Everything that we can think of at the top of our head that makes prep difficult, the long cardio, the low food, the shitty sleep, all these things. There's a lot of fucking things on prep that cause your body to go under stress. So if you start hitting the point where, you know, you're dealing with direct symptomologies on the back of stress, obviously everyone gets a little bit sick on a prep every now and again. But there are stories of people on prep who quite literally, you know, they get sick. They get legitimately sick and unwell to the point where they can't do the basic tasks that they need to do on a day-to-day basis. And if you even get to a point where you have a dedicated athlete who tells you, I can't do this anymore, and they're dedicated most of the time, you should be pretty fucking confident that they need to do something about what they've done. If somebody literally tells you, I don't think I can do this anymore, obviously as a coach, you need to step back and ask, like, are they just finding it difficult? But if somebody is sick and they're unwell to the point that they're not able to do what they need to do, I think that's probably the point where I always call it. Sometimes obviously the mental declinations of stress, I guess you could call it. I think we're going a little bit off the woods of actual stress here now, but there are certain aspects where like the level of the difficulty and the challenge of the whole process would be enough for me to kind of say no. You know, it's hard to define it, because like, is mental stress in terms of like, I'm just finding it hard because this is hard, or I'm finding it hard because it's making me physically sick. Like, where, how different are those terms? You know, like, are you really sick if it's just a mental? I think you're just more susceptible to a level of mental declination that can be talked out of and is most likely to do with something that you're just finding hard than when you're physically manifesting a sickness or an illness. You know, there's a legit pathology going on. That's for me, that's a red flag straight away. If somebody's a little bit run down, okay, you're a little bit run down. Like, I'm cool with you kind of cracking on here if we can manage this well, and you action something as a response of being run down. If someone's just run down and you're like, fucking do it anyway, you know, it's like, okay, that's not really going to work either. You know, so pulling cardio down, pulling somebody out of that hole of fatigue, does it get better? Yes. Okay, sweet, straight back in again, generally it's fine. If that sustains and sustains and sustains and sustains, you really need to be like in a situation where it's like, okay, if you're sick, are you going to look your best? No. If you're sick, are you going to be able to do all the things that's needed to get you to the end of the line? No. You know, how much is there really that much validation to continue in the first place, pure, besides the sake of finishing? No. So in my case, working with higher level guys and girls who are going for top places and they're going for cards, if somebody is sick, why do I finish prepping them, or why don't they just take the brakes off for a couple of weeks? Because I'm trying to make them win. I'm trying to make people win. I'm not trying to make people finish a prep. It's two very different things. Yeah, you know, finish a prep and winning at a show are two very different things. So if you get sick, don't be afraid to pull yourself out for a period of time. You know, and no, I mean legitimately sick. Like, I don't mean like, oh, pulling out, taking a break, cake. You know, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like, you legitimately need to take a break. Then, okay, pull yourself out and jump back in, you know, but like, that's probably where I'd call that physical manifestation of illness is why I pull back.
Yeah.
And that's it, isn't it? It's that fine line isn't it? I mean, I think that there's quite a few, I've had quite a few messages on the back of these podcasts where first timers are sort of learning sort of things through this podcast, which is incredible. But as a first timer, I suppose it's much more difficult to differentiate when you're actually reaching that point versus
for sure.
a seasoned athlete where they know full well where their limitations lie. Like, is there any symptomology for a first time athlete really that they can be less concerned about, things like fatigue, that kind of thing? Or would it be relative?
That's where you're crossing the border of like how much of this is in my head and how much of this is in my body. You know, like I think for most people, like the answer to fatigue is just fucking get on with it. That's for most individuals. Most individuals, the answer is put up and shut up and do what you need to do. You're just being a bit of a pussy, quite frankly, you know, because that is unfortunately sometimes kind of how deep the thoughts actually need to go on a prep. Sometimes you are just being a bit of a fanny, you know, and you got to just keep cracking on and keep doing your thing. So that's absolutely fine. That needs to be something that's very much clearly labeled out to a first timer. You know, I've got very few first timers now. I've got one or two. Hannah Cuthbert is my next first timer. She's a bikini athlete I coach right now. You know, we spent a long time. Grace will tell you, Grace has kind of heard how I've coached Hannah. They're just kind of getting her aware of what to expect. You know, that kind of way. This is what this can be like. You know, this is what can happen. This is what you will probably run into, and this is how we're going to get on top of it. So, like, you know, my whole process with Hannah from the start up to the finish is really kind of not so much experimental, but I've been trying to see what can I do to get this person ready for the challenge that's ahead of them, you know? And I've got to really throw myself into a back and forth with her. And it seems to have proved to be really, really well made. And like, you know, the ability to be able to have conversations about things that she's already been prepared for already has shown itself. So I think as a first timer, I think the more preparation that you can do and the more time you really think about how hard this whole thing is. You know, I'm not necessarily somebody who believes that you should do bodybuilding unless you have a goal of winning something. Like I do fully believe that if you really just want to try bodybuilding, just do photo shoots. But I think that that's my opinion. I know it's not everyone's opinion, but I think if you're, and I don't mean win like a pro card, I just mean like win, like you're going to the show to do well, like you're trying to win. I think that's really the kind of the border you need to cross. Like I think if you're just trying to compete for the sake of it, like these things that I'm talking about, I just think they're too difficult to prepare for. You know, you do not do a bodybuilding competition just to try. And that is my opinion. Okay. It is an opinion that I have. And I think that what people anyone who's listening to this who may be kind of shouting back at the screen a little bit, just what I'm talking about is from an experiential point of view. I promise you can get that same feeling from doing a photo shoot for yourself. You know, if what you're after from never competing, but maybe having a different opinion to me is probably just lies in a photo shoot, you know, and then make your decision. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's going to veer off point a little bit. So in that respect, I think, is there anything that you could like pick up as a first timer? Like, again, the same, if you're genuinely sick, you know, that's probably something to look at. And if the mental toll of it truly does become terrible, like if you are binging, like as soon as you binge, you know, tell your coach, have a conversation, investigate it, truly ask yourself, are you going to be able to pull it in after this one? If you start to see it happen multiple times, from my experience, drop the prep. Just drop the prep, and just understand that your mind was so under stress that you did the only fucking thing you're not supposed to do, you know, which is eat loads of food. And that's fine, right? It's absolutely fine that you did that. What's terrible is lying about it, overworking yourself off the back of it, doing it again, and then repeating that process. If you have binged once, twice, 3 times on a prep, it's done. It's over. Okay, it's over. Once, sometimes you can get away with, but again, most of the time, unless you're very open with your coach, immediately after it happens, I did this thing. I'm sorry. Can we please try and get on top of it? Done. If you're a coach and you're listening to this and your immediate thought is you big fat fucking tick, then you need to fucking quit. Okay. Yeah. I get it. It's incredibly frustrating when somebody does those things. It's incredibly frustrating. You getting angry is not going to fix the problem, which at its bare bones is stress. You go and you shouldn't have done that. Do you care about your goals? Do you really give a shit? Do you really love your dog? You know, all these things are going to be like heavily affecting that person straight away. And as a coach, you need to think, right, how do I take this? In my head, I could be like, you big fucking fat, you know, outwardly, I'm like, right, sweet, let's get this sorted. Don't worry about it. Yeah. Jump on a call. Something like that, right? Just try and manage it. Happens again, done.
Yeah, and arguably the the response that you might get from your coach off the back of that and the guilt you feel will actually do more harm than the binge itself. And you also have to then ask yourself, why is this happening? Like, there's a reason why it's happening. The stress is too much. And I think the biggest thing for a first timer is also going into your prep, making sure that you have all the ducks in a row when it comes to your entire life, because spoke about it with Oscar Young before, like prep brings up things. Yes, it's a good kind of coping mechanism and it can be a distraction, but it can also bring up a lot of things. And for us females, just make us extra sensitive. So make sure that you're going into it in a financially stable position, you know, that you're not going into it, you know, in a kind of rookie relationship where you might break up in a couple of weeks' time, or you're going into it with, you know, a tough relationship with food and then you end up binging a couple of weeks in, you know. So there's all of these things that you need to kind of look at as a first timer. But I suppose I want to touch on specifically like within the prep scenario itself, Ross, you were saying like, you know, you just kind of shut up and get on with it, you know, when it comes to the fatigue element of it. And that's great. And we have, you know, athletes and we know of them that we do push through these things, but there does come a point where what we're doing in a prep scenario can make us be quite unresponsive physically as well. So when you run into those issues with athletes, and I know you've been doing it quite frequently with Hannah Wares, and you told me the other day that it's something that you're implementing quite often, and that is kind of like small little diet breaks as well and refeeds and stuff like that. So how in a prep scenario for those athletes that kind of, you know, can push through everything that they need to do, how do you manage that, the fatigue, to still bring about the best look possible at stage?
Good question. Yeah, so obviously we know that the impact of stress is a hormonal one. We know that it affects the HPA axis. We spoke briefly on that in the previous podcast where we spoke about how the area of your brain, your hypothalamus, produces these hormones in this downstream way to create things. So we won't go too heavily into that. We're going to focus on stress, but essentially the availability of stress in your kind of external environment is going to affect that quite heavily. So things like your thyroid output, as stress is being responded to from the central nervous system, your body will start to respond to these stresses, be that energy being low, be that low energy availability from food, high output, you know, all these things that from the outside looking in, if you had no eyes, the brain will be registered as in, like, you're probably dying, you know, like something is happening here. You're not in a very good environment, you know. So, okay, I'm going to lower your metabolism so the body fat you have on your frame you maintain, because clearly out there it's really, really hard. I'm going to lower your sex hormones down because definitely it's really hard out there. There's no way you're going to be having kids. So you start to see, oh, those hormones are responding to what they think is out there to a certain extent. It's a positive response, if you will. But the effect is it directly affects your metabolism. The effects are it directly affects your sex hormones, which of course are part of the reason that you feel the way you feel, you live the way you live, you know, you have sexual function the way that you do. You know, all these things are going to interlink to all of these things that we then manifest as, oh, my results are slowing down. No, your metabolism is dropping, right? And then I'm doing everything right and nothing's happening. Okay, red flag. You know, you start to feel that slow, shitty feeling of just like self-loathing and just day-to-day loathing. And, you know, it's kind of making it sound more worse than it is for the comedic effect. But you start to feel pretty shit towards the end. And even towards the middle, that could be the slow declination in your sex hormones. You know, you're starting to feel less of yourself, so to speak. And some people have described that feeling as feeling vacant. I think we can all know that feeling of being quite literally feeling vacant. You're there, you're there, but the lights are off, you know?
Yeah.
And we all know that kind of feeling. So these responses are going to be directly related to your results. Because again, if you have a slower metabolism, you lose weight slower. You're going to have to do way more cardio, you know, or you're going to have to eat less food. You're going to have to manage that. Obviously, as an assisted athlete, we have exogenous tools that kind of come into play on that one. So again, you can use things like thyroid hormone to replace that lost thyroid, or use more than replacement to garner a certain effect, which for most females is not necessary beyond a certain level. Then you obviously have things like lipolytic drugs that are going to be able to come into effect, like clenbuterol. Like I said, increases in cardio, lowering of food, increases of baseline expenditure in the form of steps, you know, but they're kind of the things that you have in your favor to kind of manipulate from. And then when it comes to how you manage stress overall, or how you manage that responsive stress, again, in some cases, it is a replacement of certain hormones. You're managing the stress by replacing what is lost directly, or you're trying to kind of get on top of that stress by utilizing maybe acute bumps in food, where the energy availability of that individual goes up. In some cases, depending on the individual, you might see a very small acute increase in metabolism as the body churns through more food and kind of carries on that effect. I always say it's kind of like, you know, Scooby-Doo runs. And he kind of goes like that, and it kind of carries on that metabolic effect kind of after they've run a past. That's kind of the little analogous way of thinking about how that kind of works. So they're kind of the ways that you would kind of pick up the tolerance to the stress. You if you really want to like replenish somebody's fatigue, it's probably going to take you about a week of resetting somebody's food. It takes a little bit longer than that. And that's like, that is ticking the box of physiological fatigue has been, replenished and ready to go again. It's going to take a lot longer than that. The reality of things like refeeds and diet breaks, I don't know how long anyone's ever ran them. I don't see much utility relative to the goal running any longer than 2 to 3 days on a prep. So is it really a diet break? No. I might be just giving this person some more food I'm basically giving them more food so they can get away with more cardio. It's like that's, and everyone, yourself, you've seen your coach give you, okay, I'm going to give you a feed in anticipation for pulling you down again. You're trying to give them that little bit of a sustenance to get the head start on that ability to kind of work hard. That's more so what you end up doing in a prep. You're kind of leveling that person off and then giving them the opportunity to take that step, leveling them off, give them the opportunity to take that step and take it. When you get to a certain composition with a female athlete, that's a really, really good way to get it done, is to give slight regularity to an increase over time that allows them to continue to edge forward in conditioning. As soon as you hit conditioning, go back to that number that you just set to replenish everything and hold it there. It's a really nice, foolproof way to hold conditioning at the hold where you need to be, and then you can manipulate from that point. So that's a nice way to get on top of it. I call it kind of buffering. When you get to a certain point, so you're kind of buffering that individual as and when you need to. And then obviously you have things like deloads and manipulations in training. I don't necessarily do planned deloads in a prep. Linear drops off in volume where you can deem it appropriate tend to work very well. If I know someone's food is dropping down, if they're feeding me back really hard fatigue, I'm probably going to drop their volume down. That kind of thing works really, really well. And inevitably you get to the point where all training just kind of feels shit. Like if you're taking a full week's devolume or deload in the middle of a prep, how productive can you be in that period of time? Probably not as much as you could if you were actually training a little bit. So being smart about accumulatory volume, maybe using like a lower basis of volume for a week, maybe one session rather than fully coming off again, because you have to balance the goal in the long term with the goal with the short term. Short term goal, reduce some of that fatigue, and it's reduced. You're never going to clear. And then get to the end goal of being in condition. How much can I sacrifice relative to that fatigue? And what is the reward of bringing that fatigue back up relative to what is the reward of being able to continue to sustain that long-term macro thinking goal? Is the micro more important or is the macro more important? Then you base your decision off that. So that's kind of how that runs from there. So what will stress do? I suppose that, we're off a bit of a tangent there again, but
No, it's great. Covered it all really, all aspects of it as well. It was interesting you said about the diet break, because I only put my client Shannon on it, and after the 2 days she was already like, I can't wait to go back to my normal food. So it's like you said, like psychologically that person is just like ready to kind of push on and manage the lower food or whatever comes their way. And the training side of things is interesting as well, because you tell somebody to completely rest that often, and that's psychologically off the back that they're like, oh god, I'm losing progress, I'm not training, and that's why that kind of like just the devolume, especially in a prep scenario, I think is a lot better. In off season, absolutely, because in training intensity is so much higher. You might warrant the full few days rest, but I think in a prep scenario, definitely just to manage this the head stress more than the body stress more than anything. It's interesting.
How do you do that, Ross? Like, because I've been in that position, Grace, that you're saying, like taking multiple days off, and psychologically, like you said, the impact when you're actually in prep, I think psychologically you're geared up for it. That you're counting down to a show or whatever you've got coming up, or multiple shows. The condition that's required, especially if you've had your eyes open and you've looked at shows. The conditions required. So how do you manage an athlete's like mental stress as well at that point, in terms of actually taking the step back in order to manage the fatigue, because that is challenging in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it's weighing it up to the psychological basis of each athlete. Now, to be honest, as I always say, at a certain point of prep, in one way or another, every athlete kind of likes the same thing. Everyone would kind of fancy a refeed, but they're happy enough to crack on if they don't. Everyone kind of gets to that kind of middle ground, and it's about understanding like athlete psychology at that point. And I think if you ask anyone now while on prep, I'm going to tell you to take a week-long break from training, or I'm going to tell you to take 2 days, 4 days off from training. How does that make you feel? It makes me feel really weird. It 100% makes them feel weird. It would make me feel weird. It makes everyone feel 4 days off training. It's like, that's a bit mad. 4 days left with my own thoughts in my apartment on my own while on prep, while feeling
no food.
Yeah, exactly. No food, just sitting there, yamming on 1,200 calories a day and, waiting to go back to the gym. And it's like, how rewarding do I really think that period of time is going to be for somebody? Fucking zero. I honestly don't see any value in that at all. And this is why I really don't agree with legit deloads on prep. I think it gives you time to have thoughts that you shouldn't be having. Unless you have a really strong positive support network. Maybe if Grace was told to take a deload, but she could just sit there and sit beside me and I could have conversations with her, maybe that'd be more warranted. But if you have to take it as the N+1 as the athlete. So I would do more so reductions in volume when I need to, a reduction in volume and an increase in food. I very rarely gotten to a point where I've ever had to do both of them at the same time. A well-managed prep should allow you to take pretty minor adjustments to get you back up, as and when you need to. So, just pulling volume down, like an acute reduction in, overall sets, potentially just going in and just doing your back off sets, go in there and just do your back off sets. And between now and Friday, rather than doing 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, let's do 1 on, 1 off for the next 5 days. And then that's a nice way of kind of, okay, I'm training a little bit less, but I'm managing these things a little bit better. But again, just finding individual ways to manage and do less. The best way to manage stress is to do less. So do less cardio, do less overall dieting by increasing your food up. So again, it's kind of a messy one there, but that's essentially what you're trying to do. You're trying to find a way to navigate doing less. And I think if you understand how to speak to an individual athlete, you can kind of garner how to manage their head in the first place. I would very, very rarely give an athlete on a prep. In fact, I've never done it. I've never given an athlete on prep a full legit deload, like where they take, a week off training. I've never done that with anyone. I would rather give somebody more food. I would much rather give somebody more food or less cardio.
Yeah, I don't actually think I've ever taken a deload fully on a prep. But when you think about it, it's interesting. But right now I'm taking a full deload, but I can mentally manage it as well. It's interesting. We talked about it a little bit with Cal on the podcast as well when it comes to just fast forwarding to the likes of peak week, and it's something that I've obviously experienced recently with coaching Catherine as well. It's an interesting one because especially even when, take Yemi, for example, going towards this big show in a couple of days, it's like you're so volatile in that week as well to stress. Well, not Yemi, he's just an anomaly really, but like, little things. For example, not crashing the car, but we were on the highway on the way to London, all those little things. So how as a coach do you manage it? And I suppose what advice would you give to those on peak week who do find that they're quite volatile, and things can kind of suppose get them and it does impact the look, like it definitely does. You see it time and time again. So how do you kind of manage that as well?
I just moved them to my house.
Moved him in.
So move all your athletes.
Just move in with your coach.
That's it.
There's going to be some very, very overcrowded properties soon.
And then that causes stress.
You're going to give me another job in my daytime.
No, within that, it's pre-planning. I think when you're trying to look at managing peak week stress, you have to be planned ahead. You absolutely have to have everything planned beforehand. Book your hotel, understand how you're going to get everywhere. If you have anything that you need to sort out, like a passport, then please make sure that you get that sorted. If you have anything that you need to stay on top of, just make sure all of your ducks are in a row. Quite literally, you have everything organized. You know where you're staying, you know where you're going, you know how to get there, you know how you're getting there. Just minimize the opportunity for the stress to leak in. That's what you need to do in any situation. Be it all season prep, in the middle of prep, you're just minimizing the opportunity for stress to get in. And then when it comes to kind of directly influencing stress in terms of what I'm doing with people, I'm literally just dropping everything that could be causing a higher basis of fatigue, generally in a linear fashion. If a client is ready 2 weeks out and you say you are ready, then immediately from that point of being accepting that they're ready, you're doing something to get out of that hole. So be it an increase in food, or you're reducing cardio, or you're reducing steps, you're starting to take some of those stressors away from the body. I've been doing it with Yemi, for example. I would say he's a pretty bad example for a bikini girl, but given the waist and everything, I'm going to say he probably is a pretty good.
He's killing.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to do the same thing with Yemi. I'm trying to keep his glutes full and his waist small. So, so I guess he's
after my own heart.
I guess he's pretty applicable. But even for example, Hannah Wares. I'm currently coaching Hannah Wares. Everyone probably listening to this knows Hannah Wares. So big up Hannah. She's working her ass off. So she had a pretty assertive push into that latter end of her prep. In the lead up to her shows, but she's pretty much ready now. So kind of all I've been doing now over the past kind of 7 to 8 days, I believe, kind of since you pull it back, just little reduction in cardio. She had a 2-day refeed the other day, so I've reduced her cardio. I have given her an excess of like, 150, 200 carb a day for the past 2 or 3 days. And she's actually pulled off like a kilo. She's seeing her body. It's just the process of the body in the latter stages of prep is sometimes an inexplicable one. Now, there's obviously explanations. Like if you think about, for example, one of the things, you ever have somebody's had like a big heavy refeed and then like they drop off weight, so it's men more than often. Sometimes like that's just an increase in motility. They just increase their motility and they just shit more than they normally do. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, you lost weight. It's like, you just processed that food because it was food to process, the kind of way. And that's these things, like they kind of become the anomalic actions that we often kind of respond to in a prep. But in some circumstances, you do see an upregulation in metabolic rate because of this impact the food has on a depleted body, because the body is quite literally using that food for energy. And it's providing energy via that food. So the metabolic demand increases. So that's where you start to see that kind of creep in. So with that in mind, you can't do any of that. You can't get any of that. You can't get any of that return if the body is still in a stress state. You need to pull the body down, and the body will then respond to those acute increases in food even better. So when I do decide to go in and give Hannah a kind of more heavy carb up, A, I have data on what I've done before, and B, I know she's approaching it from an even better position. So things like pulling, this is the base of things like depletion weeks. The idea is that you're getting more responsive to these things. But if you fuck up a quote unquote depletion week, which happens all the time, like that last week you're prep, you're doing like no carbs, mega cardio, 2 days out, pull everything. The body doesn't tend to respond as well. It tends to be more stringy, because any food you give it, it's like, no, I need that. No, it pulls, and you're left with nothing to actually utilize within the cosmetic outcome of the look. So what you're really trying to do is you're trying to gauge the actual compositional body fat set point up until you have it, and then it all becomes about the look. How am I going to get the body prepared to respond as favorably as I can to my very last food adjustment before this person gets on stage? Because the reality is you've garnered this 20-week prep or this 16-week prep for the sake of about 20 minutes. It's a mad thing to think, for the sake of it, you've done this crazy thing to look that way, to look our way, to look a certain way that you want to look for about 20 minutes. In terms of like the direct look that you want to win the show. We're lean for 10, 12 weeks. The value of that, the Instagram photos, we all love that part of it. No one doesn't, don't lie, and then everyone loves it. Everyone does it.
Still posting the throwbacks.
We love the gram. We love the likes.
Yeah, everyone does.
Need that content for long term.
Yeah, exactly. I can't wait to use, exactly. I can't wait to use these to talk about deadlifts in 6 months, Joe.
I feel seen.
Yeah. Dieting on prep is you like eat a Twix and post.
We've spoken a lot about mechanical things that you would adjust in terms of like fatigue, so like dropping off activity or expenditure for a brief period of time, or food manipulations and things like that. Are there any supplementation? Because obviously, like, you're talking impact on the body. It's not only sort of like up in your brain, for example, and the stress that you're dealing with from a dieting standpoint and exertion, but it can mess with your digestion. It can mess with all kinds of things in terms of responses. So is there supplementation as well that you'd be looking at to try and manage that, or is that again relative to the person and what?
Supplement yourself off your phone as well. If I could do one thing, honestly, if you could do one thing to minimize stress in a prep, is when the time comes to delete Instagram. I would say there's nobody listening to this who's prep before who did anything even remotely like that. So obviously that's kind of one thing. But then direct supplementation, like you have any. So okay, let's think about the systems that we are kind of trying to keep in a really good spot when it comes to prep. You're trying to keep your metabolic systems in prep. You're trying to keep your immune systems in prep. You're trying to keep everything steady and everything moving alongside the pace that you are. It's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep all your systems are supposed to be in prep. One of them, we can't let them die off, so everything's trying to be moving with you. So direct supplementation for things like your nervous system, your immune system, like all these things, they're going to be valid. But like in terms of like direct supplementation, anything that affects things like sleep or even like magnesium would be a good one. And then you obviously have products like things like what's the song? Support Max from Strom, things like that. They're all governed around managing the kind of processing speed of the body to go from fight or flight and pull itself away from the stress response. Whenever you hear of things like Support Max, you'll often hear the kind of the autonomic nervous system being mentioned, and that's the kind of balance between fight or flight and rest and digest. And that's really what you're trying to balance at any point in time within your life or within a prep particularly. It's just where you're weighing on that side of fight or flight, or rest and digest. when you're in the gym, you're requiring those stress responses. You're using those stress responses, especially from things like norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are driving things like blood flow and vasoconstriction, nutrient utilization. Those hormones are actually using and triggering the body to use those things in that environment. But then if you have things that you're on the other side and you're trying to go to bed or you're trying to chill out, and all you can think about is the fact that, you can't find the sugar-free honey that you got off some random supplement shop, and you just can't, you're just panicking the entirety of the time, and your body on the outside registers that you've lost one of your children, and you're just like heavily stressed to the point that you're just in this crazy freak out. Because oftentimes that's kind of what you can compare it to. The gravity of the situation and the way that you respond to it is so beyond necessity. Like we all know it. You've all done something. Yeah, exactly. Or you spill oats, or you could literally can't find like your keys, and you're bawling into your hand. I know, because I've done it before as well. Even in my own prep, everything bothers me. But it's like, it's almost just, it's the way the body is recognizing things. It's this like instinctual behavior and action. Like, remember I've said before, the whole caveman thing. You're simply just thinking like a really bad caveman who's like, oh, it's like, I'm panicking over the wrong things, or someone's going to eat me. It's that kind of thing. So, when you start looking at these and you start kind of being objective about it, they're the kind of things that we can get on top of. And, in terms of like supplementation, if you can stay on top of your ability to just manage that system and manage your body, I think there's no real direct, you can say things like ashwagandha and, things that affect all nervous system balance and communication, because it's really just neural communication. We're good. You don't need to stress now. That's really what you're asking the body to do. So anything that's going to promote your ability to manage that, but I think directly affecting stress, like some people might say alcohol or something stupid, or have a glass of wine or smoke a joint or something like that. But the reality is you need to be able to get on top of stress more effectively than that. I think most of your ability to impact stress and manage stress is probably going to be on behaviors, not supplements that you take. Get your health supplementation in on the basis of keeping the systems in check, and you'll inevitably lower the impact of stress on those systems. But for the most part, I think stress is nearly always going to be best managed by actual actions that you take day to day. Checking in with yourself, journaling, whatever it is that you use, checking in with your family, avoiding being on your phone all the time. It's a fucking cesspit, Instagram is, and it's fine because social media is amazing, but it's also difficult. Anyone who denies the difficulty of social media and its impacts on prep is just being stupid. Like, everyone has it. Everyone looks at their phone, sees a physique or sees something they don't like, or see someone they don't like, and it affects them far more than you would like it to, and you're comparing yourself, and it just rolls and rolls and rolls from there. So if you can get on top of that element of things, I think it's better. Funny enough, me personally, I'm not too bad at that kind of thing when it comes to comparative, like physiques and stuff like that. I'm really not too bad. But I know Grace has often struggled with that. I'm sure Julie's not the only person who's in this conversation, be the listener or be it yourself, Jade, who's struggled with the same thing. Sure. I get it for other aspects, but not necessarily for that kind of thing. I think because I'm in the coaching game and I'm pretty well established in that game, my kind of my role and my kind of place within bodybuilding, I think is set for now. So it doesn't bother me because I have other value in the sport beyond just how I look. But I think for a lot of people who really call themselves athletes, who truly are enveloping themselves as an athlete like you guys, it becomes a lot more difficult because your comparative ability to pull you back into I'm valuable in bodybuilding, so to speak, is a lot harder. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it's susceptible and why you kind of get on top of it. And again, if you can just think like that, if you can try and have these kind of triggering thoughts in your head that I'm probably thinking like this because I don't have the ability to register it back. I'm just trying to find my place. I'm just trying to be, we're all trying to find our place in bodybuilding. You can be damn sure that, and there's probably a likelihood that on one prep or another, anyone who's listening to this, you probably looked at the physique and you went, I'm scared of her. They probably looked at you at one point on that prep and went, I'm scared of her. We're all going through the same shit, the kind of way we're all getting on top of it. And it's all these elements that are going to be like truly impactful in your prep. I've seen that firsthand with Yemi. Obviously, he is a guy, and I keep mentioning him, but he's the first athlete I've ever had in front of me for an entire prep. So that's the only reason I keep bringing him up. Having someone's stress response genuinely really, really low works really, really well. It really, really does. And your ability to do that, and however you can get on top of that, and however you can truly keep yourself at an even keel and just stay level-headed is kind of the overarching term I would use. Doing your best to truly stay level-headed and think sensibly and think, within ration and within reason of what you're doing all the time, it will make your prep and inevitably the way that you look significantly better. I think that was one of the questions you asked me, was its impact on look.
Well, it's true though, and like the reality is everybody's stressors are different. Okay, like what we're putting our bodies through with output, but there's different elements of our life that could be more triggering. And I think as time goes on and the more you can the more seasoned you become, I think, Jade, you agree, like you kind of recognize, okay, right, this is what is actually causing the most amount of stress for me, and how can I manage it going into the next one? And for me, it was like like we spoke about, it's like the fatigue that you get off the back of cardio and stuff, that was impacting my quality of work. And then the fact that I felt like my quality of work wasn't as good as it could be, that was making me feel guilty and make me feel bad and stressed and stuff like that. So it's like, it's just like a vicious circle at the end of the day. But I think if you can become aware of it in a prep and say, right, this is what is triggering me, maybe it's the finances, maybe it's work, maybe it's my relationship or whatever, you can manage it going into that next one. That is a massive win, because all of our stresses are different on a prep at the same time. But I suppose, just kind of jumping the gun a little bit, I don't actually have it down as a question, but when coming out of a show, and obviously I've experienced it myself a lot, like the difficulty in that kind of post prep period can be just as challenging. And when we speak about like, thyroid and trying to get back that into a good place and your hormones and all that kind of thing, it can be really, really challenging. So what do you as a coach kind of do throughout that period of time to manage the kind of psychology of the athlete?
Sure. It's a tough one as well, because the thing that's going to have the most positive impact on how stress impacted your body when you finish a prep is going to be food steadily increasing and doing less. And then the one or two things in the world that you're scared of the most when you're finished a prep is doing less and putting on weight and eating more food. The one thing you have to do is the biggest thing you fear, and you're facing yet another challenge when it comes to a prep. So you need to find the means by which you're going to allow yourself to move from that point. So are you going to use a reverse diet? Are you going to go back to a maintenance basis of calories? Like, what are you going to do to get yourself to that place in the most physiological, beneficial way and psychologically beneficial way? What are you going to do in both of those respects? That's kind of question numero uno that you're going to ask at that point in time. So the ideal advice that you probably would give somebody is to go back to a predicted level of maintenance and just allow that to happen and allow that to run. And the impacts of stress that that's going to have on even simply making that decision could be as big as, so for example, it's really simple, to be honest with you, when I think about it. The things that stress impacted while you were on prep, the things that stress had such a heavy impact on, if you continue to stress, if you continue to panic, if you continue to worry, you continue to accumulate stress, those very things that you are so desperately want to make you feel better, just don't. Will a little bit more food, which inevitably we're all going to, very few of us will not cross that threshold when we're finished. We'll all cross that threshold in one way or another. We will all eat more, most likely. Very few of us will continue with our prep diet. We will very rarely be that bad. We want to keep going, but when we start to see the impacts of that, that's when we start to panic, but again, just owning the fact that your body has to change, becoming so mentally prepared for that is the only thing that you can do. Because inevitably I've watched, Grace, obviously I've watched you firsthand. I've had clients before who have gained minute levels of weight, okay, and registered it as significantly more than it actually is. And that's absolutely fine. That's happened. We've all done it where you've quite literally put on maybe half a kilo. It's actually really good that it's on. You still look amazing. You were squeezing yourself in the mirror. You were doing super cool poses in the gym, but then you actually weighed yourself and your weight was up. But that fucked you. The way you look didn't necessarily fuck you, but then it starts that roller coaster of like, oh, my weight's going up, I look poor, I look bad. So it's about how you prepare yourself for that period of time, and then obviously the actions that you take at that period of time. You're reducing cardio, you're pulling back down everything. You're doing kind of what you did on peak week. You're reducing the basis of cardio but not eliminating it. You're increasing food but not overtly increasing it to a mega amount, depending on kind of what you deem as maintenance. In some cases you're reversing out. I don't subscribe to reversing as much, at least not in the traditional sense of like 100 to 200 calories a week. The depth of the deficit that you are in at the latter end of a prep is pretty significant. And really what you're doing over the course of a reverse diet in that first 4 to 5 weeks is just doing less of a diet. You're probably still in a deficit, and you'll see people's weight continually drop into the reverse diet. Like, I'm dropping in my reverse, like, thumbs up emoji. It's like, you're not supposed to do that. Thumbs up emoji. It's like these things are supposed to be kind of, moving in the other direction. So I think a good rule of thumb is to look at where your peak week food is. Obviously, if it's absolutely mega peak week, I don't mean like your actual day's loading, but maybe look at your kind of that period of time between your loading and kind of where you pull food back up to a maintenance level prior to loading. Maybe start there. you know, and then move from that point onwards, you know, and conceive that it's a reasonable thing, because I don't think you can just do one or the other. I think, you know, Grace went up to what she deemed as maintenance maybe last year, and then she wasn't exactly happy with the way that it was. So maybe some kind of meeting in the middle of the two, whatever's going to allow you to be, like, gain that physiological function. That is priority number one. I know you love abs. I know the photos are sick, but if you quite literally can't get your body to work the way it's supposed to, you shouldn't stay there. You know, it's the reality of it. We all know that, you know, that kind of way. It's like staying in a place that is, you know, inherently unhealthy for your day to day and serves no longer a purpose. That look and that physique and that risk, if you will, it all served the purpose up until the day of that show. After that, it has no purpose anymore, and you need to pull yourself away from it.
Yeah. And I think, Grace, you'll probably resonate with this a lot, but my most recent reverse as well was probably the one that I found most challenging, because the weight went on really, really, really fast, but other physiological symptoms I was getting, like hormones were racing all over the place. My cycle actually returned rapidly. Like, it was there 4 weeks later. I missed one and it was on the dot, on the money, but I was holding water in places that I could physically feel it. And I mean, is that common? Like, are there symptomology where you have potentially overstressed the body on the way out, so you've potentially set the marker too high? What would be sort of reasonable to look at?
So yeah, you can set the marker too high in terms of giving that athlete a little bit more than they need. But I think a lot of the product of these super excessive gains in weight are probably due to two things. Either in some cases just the inability to adhere, and then in some other instances it is the impact of the physiological hormonal action on the body and its effects. Because let's say you're a natural athlete, you have slowly declined your capacity in your body's ability to produce thyroid hormone and most of your sex hormones, if not bottomed them out entirely. And then you're not on prep and you're told to go and eat 3,500 calories a day, or you decide to go and eat 6.5. You don't really have the metabolic capacity to keep that food going and doing it the way it's supposed to. Eventually your metabolic rate goes down and continues to go down and stays down. And the rate by which you're eating and the accumulation of your metabolic rate, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, they're not don't run in a linear fashion. One is accumulating quite rapidly, what you're eating, and one is accumulating very, very slowly, which is your metabolic rate. So inevitably you find in that small window of time, you can do a lot of damage to your body, if you want to call it that, you know. And be that through poor managed prescription of food, the inability to adhere to it, which is, they're all normal, they're all kind of rites of passage. You know, after my first show, it was the worst thing ever. You know, I done a half natty prep, if you will. You know, would have also gone through the same kind of hormonal declinations as a female, and you know, mega weight gain very, very quickly, you know, due to my inability to prepare. But I've also met athletes who simply have just been given a higher prescription than they should, maybe off the back of a natural prep, or maybe even off the back of an assisted prep, where they used hormones that have dropped down their hormonal capacity, but then immediately removed them at the end in their entirety. And you've removed any capacity or any ability to manage the system by which you were managing through exogenous means. If you just remove T3 and T4, once their half-life and their full life is gone, they are not working anymore. The same thing with things like testosterone or different androgens, or, you know, whatever drugs you've used, they all have a finite half-life within the body by which they will then be cleared. After that, their efficacy is essentially zero, and you're left with the mental desire to want to eat, but very, very little in your system to actually manage that feeding. So it's all about the athlete and how you manage that kind of external point outside. In my case, if I have an assisted athlete, I'm keeping a replacement level of hormonal intake all the way through, at least for the first 2 to 3 weeks. You know, maybe I'm just moving to just T4 if I'm using dye therapies or whatever, but it's going to be some baseline level of lipolytic capacity, because it's not going to pick up that quick, and I know that person is going to want to eat. It's not really like the deleterious effects of having no hormonal secretion, be it exogenous or be it kind of, you know, exogenous or endogenous, is probably more than just pulling the drugs out in their entirety. So keeping a low level replacement dose in that we know isn't going to cause any deleterious effects, and allowing that to be the kind of governing factor, while the body then allows that stress to pull. Once you have the susceptibility to manage the problem, once you've traversed your reverse, once you've gotten food back up to a baseline, then let's start pulling out those drugs, because the body has a far more significant capacity to manage it now.
Yeah.
Just give it some time is what my main advice would be. Give it a little bit of time. And if you are a natty and if you've pulled off these drugs, you probably will have to have a little bit more control than other people will. But every single athlete will still have to have their relative basis of control. Go and enjoy your meals, but understand that it's not just fucking free ball in the fridge for the next 2.5 weeks, and it's the reality of what happens. We've all had. It's absolutely fine. These things do happen. Some people more than others, some people to a greater extent than others. We all have that inevitable feeling of wanting to just chew the gaff down, and that just has to be a little bit more controlled if you're going to take it kind of the non-assisted route. And then if you are taking it the assisted route, it still needs to be well managed. You just have a little bit more of a propensity to get it done if you do decide to kind of maintain some degree of function and intake throughout that period.
Yeah. And it's about managing the stress at either ends, like not doing the stress of doing too much and the stress of doing too little. So there is a fine line between either. I suppose I just wanted to touch briefly on the blood work element of things.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you commonly see kind of in blood work, either on prep or post prep, that can kind of point in the direction of, okay, your body is still under a lot of stress, either cortisol or female hormones and stuff? Like, what could people look out for on their blood work?
So this is going to sound like one of those weird things where it's like you never really know, but too high cortisol and too low cortisol are both pretty bad signs. So things with the cortisol readings, they're going to be at a level where if they're at the top end of the range, you're having to manage stress really, really heavily. Your body is fighting and fighting and fighting. It's almost at its wit's end. It's almost going to have to come out of the top end of the range. But then if you have no stress, if you know cortisol and it's dropped down to the absolute tatter's end, that's not a good thing. That is essentially your body has eliminated or ran out, quote unquote, of its capacity to utilize cortisol as an anti-inflammatory. You've overstressed your body to the point you have very little protection from other elements, and so that would be the things like the free radicals, etc., that kind of come through, because cortisol, it gets rid of all these things called free radicals that are responsible to things like oxidative stress, which is similar to what stress is. Like, it's an oxidative kind of thing, and your body then is responding to those. Basically, that's things like what's the word? I can't think about it. It's going out of my head, but your body actually responds to those stressors and those oxidative stressors. They'll come back into my head now in a second, I'm sure. That'll get me now for a little while. So I'll be back in my head. Responds to these oxidative stressors in a way. So again, think that if you don't respond to those appropriately via these mechanisms, it opens you up to like things like immunosuppression. So these are the things that you need to kind of get on top of. So when I would say that in terms of I've lost track of the question now. I can't stop thinking
the other kind of female hormones and stuff, looking at on a blood work that I know we tend to see.
So you could look at other hormones, things like HbA1c, they would be responding to things like inflammation and stuff like that. So your inflammatory hormones would be a pretty decent place to look. Obviously, if you're a natural athlete and you're going in and you're still seeing declinations in your thyroid output, you're still seeing declinations in your sex hormone output, like all of these things need to be understood. If they're still down, you're not in a situation where your body is recouping, and normally, again, most people will agree with me, you can kind of feel it when your body kind of gets back online. You can kind of feel that feeling like, oh, I feel kind of normal again. You can, and even if it's a progressive thing, you kind of get to a point where it's almost like you stop noticing how shit things were, and then you realize that 2 weeks after, you're like, oh, I don't feel a shit anymore now that I think about it. You kind of get that
2 weeks, more like 12 weeks.
Yeah. You get that kind of little epiphany moment. Maybe 2 weeks. Two weeks.
Jesus. Still not 100%.
Years. I'm working about 70. Rotating through. I feel that one as well. But they're kind of like, there's no real objective way to measure stress. Obviously, you can measure cortisol readings. You can get certain metrics on your blood work that will indicate that you are dealing with a high level of stress. Most people know when they're dealing with a high level of stress. Things just stop working. Things just stop operating the way that they're supposed to. And that should be really all the indication you need to get on top of stress in of itself. I'll very rarely have a situation where someone's like, oh, I'm stressed. Oh, get your blood work and I'll measure it just to make sure.
Last kind of resort.
It's like, I don't believe you. Get some blood work. Exactly. Get some blood work, prove it. But you can be.
It is the very last thing on the list, though, isn't it? Of contract. That's why I had it as like the last question, because it is the kind of last thing you're looking at.
In certain circumstances, like, again, it depends on how you define looking for stress. Like, if you pick up that somebody's results are slowing down and their metabolic rate is slowing down based off the actual weight readings that you're getting, you're seeing this kind of abrupt and sudden, steady, almost kind of change in relative rate of loss. You're like, what's happening there? That might be when you measure stress by getting blood work and measuring the impact of what has been a progressive stress on that person's thyroid output. So you are, in a way, still measuring stress. You're measuring the impacts of this very broadly defined thing that we call stress. So it's like understanding that you're always kind of measuring stress. You're always on a prep, you're always kind of measuring it and you're always kind of managing it. At the same time, you're managing, okay, how much more can I poke into this person before they kind of bite back at me, quite literally from a physiological perspective. And that's really what you're doing. You're edging somebody in. Sometimes you're fucking edging them really, really hard and really far forward. You're doing something aggressive, like a rapid fat loss or something. But that's essentially what you're doing. You're pushing more and more stress and tolerability onto that person if they can handle it.
Yeah. And I think on that point, Ross, obviously we've covered quite a lot of, I want to say negatives, not necessarily negatives, but they are impacts that people might be able to sort of look at and consider, okay, this is what I need to manage and this is getting a little bit out of hand. But briefly, can we just talk about, before sort of we wrap it up and stuff, about the positive effects of stress? Because if you're thinking about actually bodybuilding itself, like we've spoken a lot around like prep and management of stress in order to elicit like fat loss and things like that, and obviously get you stage lean. But on the flip side of it, it's very much a requirement from a bodybuilding standpoint to build muscle, elicit change in your physique in an off season as well. So like, I mean, how would you optimize, or how would you look at a circumstance in an off season as well? And is it the same triggers? Is it the same feedback, or is it slightly different? Are you obviously you're more equipped physiologically to deal with that at that time?
So if you imagine almost like, I wish I could pull it up kind of, but I kind of can't. If you imagine almost like a graph where you kind of have your systemic fatigue kind of going upward on the graph, and then you have your tolerability to things that are kind of what you're doing on the bottom end of the graph, as you're doing more of the things that you need to do, and inevitably you're moving forward kind of linearly at 45 degrees up that graph towards what you can manage and what you can't. That the amount that you are handling is going up, but your proximity to these really higher bases of fatigue is going up as well. So in an off season, you are still looking for the same symptomologies. You just have a lot more fucking room in between to actually do it. Within a prep scenario, you have a far lesser degree of upward trend on that graph that you kind of have available to you. It boxes it out in front of you. So you're still looking for the same kind of things. And things like stress for training, quite literally physical stress is the only reason that your body is responding. Stress is a response, and the kind of anti-inflammatory kind of impacts of stress on the body. These are the effects that then lead to things like muscle growth. These are the things that affect the neural healing, because your body is responding and adaptive in nature. It's adapting to its external environment, which is an adaptive stress response. It's like, don't want essentially muscle growth, for example. So I train a muscle, and my muscle has now been put under a level of load and tolerance and strain it never has been before. It's like, what the was that? I don't want that to ever happen again. I'm going to grow more of these things so that I'm better at doing that thing than last time. It's like, now I'm prepared. And then you come and you do more. And it's like, what the fuck was that again? And it just keeps going. And that's kind of what your body is doing. It's the adaptive response from stress. It's going, I don't want that thing to be as challenging as it was the last time. I'm going to evolve. I'm going to change. I'm going to adapt to make sure that I can deal with the external environment that I'm being placed under. That's really what your body is doing. So stress is kind of, so if you want to call it stress or adaptation, kind of whatever label you want to use, is probably the most essential thing that we have for life in of itself. To kind of get a little bit more philosophical on it, it is what governs the way the body responds at any point in time, because those stress responses, those stressors, is the body responding back and forward to the external environment around it. That includes things like fat loss. It includes things like immunosuppression. It's like this thing has entered your body, and then it responds via that stress that's entered the body and shuts off and produces things like antibodies. That is a response of stress. So again, stress is a positive thing, but it's not allowing yourself to be so susceptible to that response that it becomes bad. So you're still looking for the exact same kind of markers of stress. It will be things like fatigue. It'll be things like low mood. It'll be things like lethargy. It'll be things like opening and ailments to injuries and stuff like that. But it's just the wiggle room that you have to manage those things and kind of move closer to a higher ceiling of where you're going to meet them is just so much higher in the off season. So stress is something that's always omnipresent, but your susceptibility is really what changes. Your ability to manage stress is really what changes, not necessarily the stresses themselves. But no, so you just do more of the stresses or less of the stresses. You're always doing some degree of cardio. You're always eating some degree of food, and sometimes you're just doing more cardio, and you're opening yourself up to more of that stress. So it's definitely a hard thing to define in terms of that aspect, which it makes it both a cool conversation, also a hard one to actually kind of like knuckle down to one single point, because it is one of those things. And I really struggle to think linearly about anything. Like it's always bouncing around the head.
Yeah. No, that was brilliant. Honestly, it was really great to just condense it into the one podcast
Yeah.
because it's come up time and time again. So
Yeah.
appreciate your time, Ross. Thank
No
you
problem.
so much for coming on to chat. Where can everybody find you?
You can find me about 5 steps around the corner.
Don't go knocking on his door.
Everyone else.
Exactly. Well,
You've just freaked out the dog now. You've just freaked out the dog.
Oh no, I forgot about him.
Oh,
Anyway,
Rohan from the feature.
yeah, we need an episode.
How
about
to manage
Rohan.
your stress. Don't get a puppy when you
Yeah.
start your prep.
The impacts of canine.
Actually, I do think that Rohan probably contributed massively to my stress at the start of
Yeah,
lads prep. So tip number 1, do not get a dog.
Yeah. Rohan's great to look at, but he struggles when it comes to doing the walking thing that people appreciate dogs do.
Yeah,
Now,
you
where
can't get
can
your
you find
steps
me?
in.
Predominantly Instagram. I do have a YouTube channel. It's been pretty dead for the past kind of like 6 or 7 months. There's probably no point going to that. But predominantly, you can find me, Ross at Team Pro Coach on Instagram, alongside the rest of the team. There are currently 7 or 8 of us on the team. And if you go to our main page at Team Pro Coach, again, you can find all that there. We just released some cool merch. There's lots going on, lots of shows. The social aspect of Pro Coach is increasing quite a bit. So hopefully people have noticed that. But yeah, that's where you can find me. If anyone has any questions, you can email me in confidence with absolutely any question you have. I'm more than happy to help where I can. And you can DM me at any point in time, but I am more likely to find you in my emails. So if you're dealing with anything, have any questions, want to converse about anything, genuinely anything, and I can help, I will do so.
Lovely. Thanks a million, Ross. We will chat in a second.
See you, love.